Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar titled Solar in the Southeast 2017 Annual Report. My name is Allie Brown, and I'm the Clean Energy Advocacy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices that work to address the impacts of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We're a membership organization, and we'd like to acknowledge our members on the call and encourage those of you who are not members to join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, www.cleanenergy.org. Now I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the Zoom platform on the bottom of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendees' lines will be muted throughout this presentation. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, click the chat button and type in your problem so we can help you troubleshoot. We have also saved time at the end of the presentation to answer questions about today's topic. To ask a question, click the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, and we'll work to get as many questions as we can at the end. Lastly, we're recording this webinar, and we'll send you the recording along with key action steps we address after the webinar is finished. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter today, Brian Jacob, Solar Program Director at SACE. Brian?
Thanks, Allie, and thank you all for joining with us today to learn more about this inaugural Solar in the Southeast report. We should have a good group today. It looked like there were at least 30 already logged in when we got started. And I want to say a special thank you to those of you who are devoting your lunch hour to this, because I do realize that a large part of our region is in the Eastern time zone, and this falls during the lunch hour, so appreciate that. Let me start by posing a question, not one that I expect any of you to answer, but just to think about. Do you know how much solar your utility provides to you individually as a customer? Some of you may know and others may not, but that's among the many things that this report can answer. That is one of the things that this report can help you understand. So what I'll be doing today is sharing with you 10 slides that I distilled out of the report. I'll do that to seed the conversation, and then we'll have time for question and answers, okay? Kyle, why don't we go to the first slide? Perfect. Hopefully everybody's seeing this executive summary. I included this really in case any of you are not able to devote the entire hour to us. And it summarizes 4 key points from the report itself. The first is that the Southeast has been and continues to be on a very rapid growth trajectory. Solar in the Southeast has been doubling or nearly doubling every year since 2012, and that growth is continuing. I'll go a little bit out of order. If I jump down to utility scale dominance, just to say that that growth that we've been experiencing and what we're projecting, and you'll see this again in a couple slides, is largely dominated by utility scale projects, much less so on the distributed solar, the rooftop residential and small commercial solar. I'll be introducing you to the watts per customer ratio that we use to compare and contrast different utilities. It's a fair and unbiased standard that we can use to compare and contrast the utilities, and that helps us identify the leaders. You can look right here on the summary, says that the 3 current leaders based on the 2017 performance are Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, and Georgia Power. But I also want to say that we're not only interested in the current leaders, where they are now, we're also interested in where utilities are headed. So in just a few minutes, I'll be able to introduce you to the 7 utilities that we have designated as the sunrisers. And those are the ones that exhibit the highest forecast growth in that watts per customer solar ratio. And then lastly, for the executive summary, it's kind of hard to know what good looks like unless you have something to compare and contrast it against. So the report also identifies the laggards. And we designate three of them with this sunblocker term: TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Santee Cooper, and Seminole Electric, because they are sticking with outdated plans and have a very low solar ambition over this 4-year forward-looking time frame. Let's go to the next slide and dive in a little bit. I had mentioned that the Southeast has been on a very rapid growth trajectory. It's one of the most vibrant solar markets in the United States. And this graph shows that. If we look back at 2012, the Southeast had a little bit less than 200 megawatts of solar total. And it now, 2017, the end of 2017, we had almost 6 gigawatts, 6,000 megawatts. So that's a 30-fold increase across that time frame. And this growth actually has, to a certain extent, been bucking the national trend. I've got a couple of statistics here that are from other reports, so not referenced in ours, but to provide a little more context. You might have seen right at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, there were some reports that the solar growth in the United States had slowed down. And that was somewhat true nationwide. In 2017, the country installed less solar than it had in 2016. So about 15 gigawatts total installed in the US in 2016, and then only 12 gigawatts installed in 2017. But in the Southeast, we continued to increase the amount of solar installed. We installed 3.1 gigawatts in 2017 compared to 2.7 gigawatts in 2016. So from a capacity growth standpoint, we are bucking the national trend, and from a job standpoint. So just last month, the Solar Foundation puts out this solar energy job census every year, and they had concluded that the U.S. lost 4% of solar jobs in 2017. But in the Southeast, we continued to increase solar jobs. We actually gained 8% solar jobs in 2017 compared to how many there were in 2016. So again, justifying that the Southeast is a very vibrant solar market. And we're projecting it to increase. If you look back at the graph, and this is from page 5 of the report, by the way, we are projecting that the Southeast would have more than 10 gigawatts by 2019 and would hit a 15 gigawatt threshold by 2021. This graph also shows that difference that I mentioned between the utility scale and the distributed solar. So the utility scale is the blue bars, the vast majority of that growth. And then the yellow caps on top are the smaller rooftop residential and small commercial distributed solar. When we go further into some details about at the state level, you'll see that there are some slight variations in this, but for the most part, it's about 7/8 utility scale and only about 1/8 distributed solar. The other thing that I'll point out before we move on this graph is the 208 watts per customer. You see that in the text there by the 2017 bars. That is the total amount of solar, that roughly 6 gigawatts that we have now, divided by the roughly 29 million customers that are served in the Southeast. It's how we get to that watts per customer ratio that we use as the main metric for all of our rankings throughout this report. When we introduced the report to reporters on the launch day, we did a telepress conference, and I tried to put that in context for them. So I'll do that for you as well. It's possible that nobody on the call is still using incandescent bulbs, the old inefficient incandescent bulbs, and you potentially replace them all with LEDs by now. But we probably still remember what the incandescent bulbs were like. And in, say, a reading lamp that you might have beside your bedside, because you need the bright light for reading, you might have put a 100-watt bulb in. And so if we use that as the context for this 208 watts per customer on average around the Southeast, utilities are providing us enough solar that we could each have about 2 of those old inefficient incandescent bulbs, and that would be powered by solar. So that'll just give you a bit of a benchmark. And with that, let's go to the next slide. This is from page 6 of the report. You've got 2 tables here. I'll explain them briefly. On the left-hand side, we have the 2017 results, and on the right-hand side, we have our 2021 forecast. Both of these use our watts per customer ratio. And here we're looking at the 13 largest utility systems in the Southeast. Each one of them serves more than 500,000 customers. And you'll see there's a combination of different types of utilities here. We've got some of the large vertically integrated investor-owned utilities like Georgia Power, Florida Power and Light. But then we've also got some utilities that are grouped into the cooperatives served by Oglethorpe Power, for example, or TVA, the federally owned entity of TVA. So those are each on here, but again, the 13 largest utility systems, each one serving in excess of 500,000 customers. And if we look at the 2017 results, you can see the 3 that I already mentioned earlier. The current leaders, Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, and Georgia Power. Duke Energy Progress is far and away the leader. They're offering more than a kilowatt of solar for every customer. 1,117 watts per customer. That's more than double their sibling utility of Duke Energy Carolinas. And then you got Georgia Power, strong performance, more than 1.5 times the region average. Georgia Power coming in at 364 watts per customer on the historic ranking, 2017. I find it interesting as we shift our focus over to the right-hand side of the screen and look at the 2021 numbers, though. Not only does the average go up by a factor of 2.5, it's interesting to see how some of the utilities that had been toward the bottom, or at least middle of the pack, leap to the top of the pack by 2021. So for example, you had SCE&G, South Carolina Electric and Gas, at number 4. They're going to move up to number 2. Tampa Electric had been down at number 10, and they're going to end up around number 4. And Duke Energy Florida as well. They started out at number 9. They're going to be number 6 on our projection. And that's the kind of emerging leadership that we're looking for. Let's go to the next slide. And this will collapse it down a little further even. It was interesting to note that almost 3/4 of the Southeast is served by just 5 utility entities. So here I'm taking the family of Duke Energy, so those 2 that we've already mentioned from North Carolina, South Carolina, Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, as well as their Florida entity, put them together, and they represent that red line there. So the Duke family is already well ahead of everybody else, and they will even further distance themselves from everyone else on this watts per customer ratio over the next 4 years. Southern Company is the blue line. So that's the combination of Georgia Power, Alabama Power, Mississippi Power, and Gulf Power in the panhandle of Florida. And that blue line essentially tracks with the region average. The Southeast average is the black dashed line on this graph. That incidentally comes from page 7 of the report. Then you've got Florida Power and Light. That's the green line, showing a good, steady progress, though still projected to remain below the region average. And then you've got the other 2 at the bottom, Oglethorpe, which is the generation and transmission entity for a lot of the rural electric co-ops in Georgia. That's the yellow line. And then you've got TVA, the federal entity that serves 7 different states, but almost all of Tennessee. That's in the orange line. And those 2, Oglethorpe and TVA, you see somewhat flatlining between now and 2021 with limited growth in solar anticipated in their current plans. Next slide. This is from page 8, and this is, to me, one of the most interesting slides out of the report. These are what we call our sunrisers. So it's the 7 utilities that exhibit the highest forecast growth in that watts per customer ratio over this 4-year time frame. So it's the increase between their 2017 numbers and their 2021 numbers. Duke Energy Progress was already far and away the leader in the Southeast, and they're going to more than double their ratio over this 4-year time frame. So that's really tremendous. There's a law that passed last year, HB 589 in North Carolina, that is really driving a lot of that growth. There's an existing law in South Carolina as well, since that utility operates in both states, Act 236 in South Carolina, that is a factor for both them and for SCE&G. You see them as one of our sunrisers, South Carolina Electric and Gas. I'd also point out that it's good to see some of the munis, the municipal authorities, like Jacksonville Electric Authority and the city of Tallahassee on this. So leadership is not limited just to those investor-owned utilities. You've got some of these nonprofit municipal entities that are exhibiting leadership as well. Next slide. This is one of 2 similar looking slides from the report. This one's from page 9. It looks at this breakdown by utility across the Southeast, and all with 2017 numbers now. And this is in total megawatts. This is not our watts per customer ratio. But it's interesting that Duke Energy, combined between the North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida components of that business, represent fully half of the installed solar watts in 2017. It's also pretty interesting, I think, to see that Southern Company has twice as much installed solar now than Florida Power and Light does. But Florida Power and Light may have arrived to the game a little bit late, and they've got some pretty bold, ambitious programs. So you'll see a lot of growth for Florida Power and Light over the next 4 or 5 years. Go to the next slide. It's similar to this one. It breaks it down by state. It's not going to surprise anybody that North Carolina is the state in the Southeast that's leading, because North Carolina has the second most solar in the entire country. Only California has more. So that part is not surprising. What could be surprising is that it will even double. North Carolina is already leading the Southeast, but they will double by 2021. They'll have over 5.4 gigawatts. And Florida, with all the different utilities that operate in Florida, will actually increase 5-fold by 2021. So they'll have over 4 gigawatts by 2021, even though this slide from 2017 shows them with their 839 megawatts to start. Next slide. That last comment I made about Florida going up 5-fold over this 4-year time frame is why we show them in second place here. Even though they've got less than Georgia installed right now, they will have more. So in rank order, we've got North Carolina, followed by Florida, then Georgia, then South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. We've talked a good bit about North Carolina and Florida and Georgia. Haven't really said much about those on the other end, the right-hand side of this slide. Alabama and Mississippi have both been singled out recently as having among the highest solar growth rates, the percentage growth year on year in the United States. That's largely because they have such a small base to start with. But they are demonstrating some progress there. Tennessee, on the other hand, had actually been an early leader in the distributed solar, the small scale solar, but they've even since relinquished that leadership posture. And what we're saying now is that they're demonstrating limited interest to advance solar at any scale. I will point out that 3 of the states here do show an appreciable amount of distributed solar growth, and that would be Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The others, you can see that the yellow caps on top of their bars really don't represent a significant amount of growth. I think I have one more slide in there. Kyle, advance it and let's see. I actually have 2 more. I have one more here and then one that we might or might not talk about. This one's about the watts per customer on a state basis. It comes out of page 12 in the report. And again, you see North Carolina and South Carolina as the clear leaders. We are projecting that in 2021, 6% of North Carolina's retail electricity sales will come from solar. And in South Carolina, it'll be 4%. You can see those notations that we added on the top of the graph there. One of the things that we like to do is consider what we call the policies behind the performance. And so in this case, it's clear that it is legislation that has driven the activity in both North Carolina and South Carolina. I already referenced that they both have laws on the books that actually put in place renewable targets that the utilities have to hit. Georgia, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It wasn't legislation that drove or is driving the solar growth in Georgia. It really started with regulation. It was a strong push from the Public Service Commission here in Georgia. I say here because I'm based in Atlanta. And that's what really got the Georgia Power in particular started on this path. Oglethorpe Power has actually been doing a significant amount of solar as well, largely based on some of their progressive co-ops that they serve. Cobb EMC, for example, in Marietta, Georgia, has a high expectation for solar to meet their customer demands. And so consequently, a lot of what Oglethorpe is bringing on is to service those interests. And then again, we've got to look at the opposite end of the scale as well. With Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama, there really is no policy leadership, either legislative nor regulatory. So it's really up to the discretion of the utilities themselves to make decisions for how much solar to bring on. And I would say the results speak for themselves. I'll tell you a little bit about the rest of the report. We've got individual state profiles. So I didn't put those in the slide deck for today, but there's one page for each of the 7 states in our Southeast region. There's an appendix of about 20 pages that lists detail on all more than 400 utilities that operate in the Southeast. So you can look up your individual utility. I'm serviced by Sawney EMC in my North Atlanta outside the perimeter community. And so those results are there. And then I think I do have one more slide, Kyle, if you advance it. Yeah, this is what we call the fine print slide. Not expecting anybody to spend any time on it here. I've really included it in case we need to refer back to it. But it lists the data sources, the methods we use, and the assumptions that we factored into our report. And of course, that's in the report, and I've got it here in case we need to refer back to it. And then the last slide will have my contact details. And I'll leave that up in case anybody has questions after the fact. But now we should open it up and see if anybody has questions for the remaining time on the webinar today.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. So now we're going to open it up to Q&A. And just as a reminder, to ask a question, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type it in there. So the first one we have rolling in here is how will the solar tariffs recently enacted by President Trump impact this forecast?
Well, thanks. So you may have noticed from the title, and unfortunately it's even showing on the screen here now, this is a 2017 annual report, even though we didn't release it and get it out the door until February of 2018. But it was really based on the data that we had assembled by December 31st of 2017. And the president didn't decide on the solar tariffs until 2018, and they even only went into effect February 7th. So I like to say that this report gives us a benchmark that we can use to compare against as we go forward, and we'll be able to gauge the significance of those tariffs relative to what we had been projecting, because the projections that we've got in here are those that were put in place before the tariffs were enacted.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Next question we have here is specific to TVA. It's, would privatization of TVA help in getting solar investments increased in the TVA region?
Interesting question. And for anybody on the webinar today that may not be tracking this, that is a current proposal, at least to privatize part of TVA. I think the president's budget suggested to privatize the transmission assets of TVA. And incidentally, this is not the only president that's ever suggested to privatize TVA. I understand that there have been multiple attempts over the years to consider that. I'm not sure it's a realistic proposition at this point. And how it would impact solar. It's sort of interesting that the current leadership at TVA, anytime we have suggested to dramatically increase the amount of solar, I actually participated on a solar stakeholder advisory group for TVA last year. We had 4 different meetings, and part of the pushback that we would get from them is that it doesn't make sense for them as it does for some of the investor-owned utilities, because TVA can't take advantage of the federal tax credits because they're a nonprofit organization. And so I suppose privatizing TVA would avail those tax credits to them, and that might influence the economics. But I've already pushed back on them to say that, hey, it's not just the investor-owned utilities in the Southeast that are doing significant solar. JEA, Jacksonville Electric Authority. I use them as an example because back in fourth quarter of last year, they had gone to their board with and got board approval to do 250 megawatts of utility scale solar, 5 separate 50 megawatt projects. And they similarly are a nonprofit. They're a municipal entity. So the tax credits don't apply directly to them like they would to an investor-owned utility. And so I happened to be at one of these TVA meetings when TVA was talking about the 200 megawatt RFP, request for proposal, that they had done for solar. And I was able to compare and contrast with JEA, who serves 450,000 customers, versus TVA that serves 4.7 million customers. And yet they're both doing comparable amounts of solar. So on the one hand, it means that JEA is doing a great job, and that's why they're identified as one of our sunrisers. And on the other hand, I would say that TVA is doing an order of magnitude too low solar ambition. If they're just talking about a couple hundred megawatts, they ought to be talking about gigawatt scale solar projects like other utilities of their size would be. Florida Power and Light serves about the same number of customers that TVA does, and Florida Power and Light's doing more than 2 gigawatts of solar over the next 5 or 6 years. So I think there's a little bit of opportunity if TVA were to be privatized that might help influence the economics. I don't think privatizing TVA is a realistic proposition at this point, and I think that there are opportunities for TVA to do solar within the existing federal entity, nonprofit organization they are now, they don't need to wait.
Great question there. Next one we have rolling in here is, what's the largest solar project in the Southeast?
We have in our data set one in Georgia that's almost 150 megawatts. It's the Sand Hills solar project. That's the biggest one in the current data set, which so 2017. Incidentally, there was a slightly larger project that was just announced in Georgia as well. A 200 megawatt project was in the news last month, that'll be in Twiggs County. And so I think it's going to be, I think they start construction this year, it'll finish construction next year. And so it'll be online in our data set, partially for the 2019 year, but then completely for the 2020 year.
Great. And looks like we have one more question in the queue, but you can still type it in if you want us to read it out. We've got plenty of time. So this question is solar really cost effective compared to other forms of electricity?
Yes. Next question. No, I'll elaborate a little. So we didn't talk about the cost of solar in our report. Our report was designed to establish this watts per customer ratio for all the utilities in the Southeast so that we could do that compare and contrast. But there are a number of good reports out there on the cost of solar. One that we often cite is Lazard. They put out a levelized cost of energy report every year, late in the year, October, November, December, sometime fourth quarter. And I know that last year their the numbers what they put out is unsubsidized levelized cost of energy. So it does not include the investment tax credit. But even then, the unsubsidized costs for solar were in the range of 3.5 to 4.5 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that is completely competitive with any other traditional fossil fuel source. So I encourage you to check those out. And the rate of decline. They also they comment on what's been happening in terms of the cost reductions for each of the technologies. So they don't just look at solar. They look at wind and hydro and biomass and other things. But they had projected that, or not even projected, the data had shown that there was more than an 80% reduction in the cost of solar over the last 8 years. So that's the kind of declining trajectory that we've been on with solar costs. It's been really remarkable. And a lot of the utilities that may be using outdated information could reach inaccurate conclusions. Because if you were running your cost models with data from just 12 months ago, the economics wouldn't look nearly as attractive as they do now. So we've seen some utilities that we counsel with really perhaps using outdated information.
Thanks, Brian. And before we move to the next question, we had a comment from Christine. She wanted to know, can you say that citation you were just talking about again?
Yeah, it's Lazard, Lazard, and I think the report is called Levelized Cost of Energy. That is the metric that they look at, is the levelized cost of energy. So it's not in dollars per installed watt. There's other reports that look at it that way. They look predominantly at the cents per kilowatt hour produced by each of the technologies, the levelized cost of energy across the entire life of, in this case, a solar array.
Thanks. And looks like folks are still typing in questions. Lots of people curious here about TVA. The question is, since TVA is nonprofit government run, would any potential legislation and or state regulation apply to them?
Good question. So the regulation question is easy to answer. I'm not sure what authority a state legislation would have. It's one of these interesting beasts where there's not a whole lot of states' rights. It's more federally governed. For example, on the regulatory side, there is a Public Service Commission in Tennessee, but they have no authority over electricity. They only regulate water and telecommunications. So electricity, TVA doesn't like to be referred to as a monopoly, but that's what they are. They are a federal monopoly governed by a board that's nominated by the President of the United States and then confirmed by the Senate. And then that board ultimately provides direction to TVA itself, but then they also serve in a regulatory capacity over the 154 LPCs, the local power companies that do the distribution to the final retail customers. So it's a bit of a different beast. They're rather autonomous, and so certainly the like I said, the regulatory part of that question is easy to answer. They don't have external regulatory oversight. It's all through the board of TVA. And then on the legislation question, if something were to pass in the Tennessee legislature, I'm not sure whether that would have authority over TVA or not.
Great, good question. It looks like we have a question kind of more about the efficiency of solar and technology. Has the size of the area needed for solar gone down?
Good question. I don't address it in the report, but I had actually, even before joining SACE last year, I was doing a consulting project for a client, and this was one of the things that we were looking at. A lot of the early solar arrays were done at, say, 10 acres per megawatt, and more recently you're seeing things in the 6 to 7 acres per megawatt, largely because of the efficiency of the panels and the optimization of the density of applying those panels to the available surface area. And then the client that I was working with was evaluating a kind of a different approach that would really dramatically increase that density issue, the fill factor, to where you might be able to get a megawatt on as little as 3 acres of land. So things have been improving. It hasn't been as dramatic a shift as the costs have been coming down the way that I mentioned, 80% reduction over 8 years. But yeah, there have been some improvements in the conversion efficiency of the panels.
Thanks, Brian. We kind of have a follow-up from Joyce about the first question about regulating TVA. She says, so if we can't regulate or legislate TVA, how do we make solar attractive to TVA?
Well, there's different modes of engagement for TVA. You don't have the same connection points and engagement models that we have in other states where a Public Service Commission would allow us to intervene. But the primary ways to correspond and communicate with TVA are, one, their board meetings. I mentioned that their board provides the direction for TVA and the governance and regulatory approvals for the LPCs. Those board meetings 4 times a year are open to the public, and they even start with a listening session. So you can go in as an interested individual and sign up to speak, and generally they give each person 3 minutes. I don't have a whole lot of experience with them yet, having only started this particular job last year. And from what I've seen so far, I'm not sure how the comments that are expressed at the board meetings result in any tangible actions, but hopefully there is a way to connect those dots, and I'll start to see more of that, because I have witnessed people making comments at that board meeting saying that, hey, I'm a customer and I want more renewable energy than you're currently offering. So that is one opportunity. Another is when they do their major changes, like, for example, they just launched last week a rate structure change. And because they're a federal entity, they're governed by NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and they have to undertake an environmental assessment associated with those. And that has a public comment period associated with it. So, in fact, there's two things that are current open comment periods with TVA. One is that, and I'm not sure what the dates were for when comments are due. I think it's a 90-day comment period on that rate change. The other is that they've initiated an IRP, an integrated resource plan, and that is, they're currently collecting comments and input on that through April 16th. And there's a formal process for submitting those comments. So there are multiple ways to express individual expectations to TVA, and then they will take those on board, and hopefully it will impact the decisions that they make.
Thanks, Brian. And just for reference, I pulled up, for the new rate proposal, it looks like it's a 30-day comment period. So folks have until April 9th, but look out for more information from SACE on that. Last question we've got here is, again, lots of folks curious and interested in TVA. The question from Bob is, are community-based solar customer buy-in projects about the only viable solar projects within the TVA system?
Great question. We're full of good questions. So first, let me make sure everybody understands community solar. And as SACE, as an organization, our vision of success would be for all of the market segments of solar to function efficiently together. So that would be the residential rooftop market, the commercial and industrial market, the community scale market, and the utility scale market. We don't want anyone to crowd out the others. We want to advocate for policies that are enablers of all those. Community scale projects are interesting because they offer an opportunity for some individuals who would like to put solar on their homes, but for some reason they can't. Maybe there's too much shading where their home is and it wouldn't be practical. Maybe there's a homeowners association that has restrictive covenants that forbid solar, or maybe the people don't own the home. Maybe they rent and aren't allowed to put it on their roof. But community scale projects are cropping up various places, and they're creating a different kind of opportunity for people to get solar for themselves. They tend to have pretty good economics because they're larger arrays. They're near utility scale sizes. And since there's so much interest in TVA, there was a new TVA-led project in Nashville that launched just last week. I think it's called the Music City Solar Project, but that's what it is. And they had a previous one in Chattanooga that I visited as well. I had mentioned as well that I'm serviced by Sawney EMC, and just last week I got a notice in the mail that Sawney is doing a community scale solar project, and I can buy in. The models, the economic models for these vary in that sometimes you buy panels, sometimes you buy them outright, and they sell you a panel for, say, $300. You can buy as many as you want, and then each month you get the amount of kilowatt hours that's generated by it credited towards your bill. Sometimes you pay per month, And that's the way the Sawney project is set up, the one that I have the opportunity to buy into. And then similarly, so I'm paying a fixed amount per month for a certain number of panels. What's variable in that is their output. So it obviously they put out more in the summer than they do in the winter, and weather conditions vary. And cloudy days they won't put out as much as they do on sunny days. So the risk shifts back to the off-taker in my case. And there's a really interesting one that I need to mention, in part because City of Tallahassee was one of our sunrisers that I showed you on that graph. A large driver of what City of Tallahassee is doing is perhaps the best of all the community solar projects that we've seen so far in the Southeast. They built initially a 20 megawatt array out by the Tallahassee airport. And the way they structured the program is that people who voluntarily sign on to it would pay 5 cents a kilowatt hour for the output from it. But on their bill, then they wouldn't pay the fuel cost surcharge that the people that are receiving conventional power would pay. So at this point in time, it looks like it's a slight premium versus what their neighbors who don't do the solar would be paying. But that 5 cents per kilowatt hour is fixed, I think, for 20 years. So as the fuel cost component of everybody else's bill continues to go up, this is a long-term investment in stability of bills and, of course, the environmental attributes that come with getting solar. So I really like the Tallahassee project. It was way oversubscribed when they first launched it. So they've got a waiting list now as they're building out another 40 megawatt array companion to that original 20. So that's an interesting model. And back to the question, though, now that I've gone all over the map, I think the question was, is community solar the only way to get solar in Tennessee? It's not. Tennessee TVA still has the opportunity to do a lot more utility scale solar than they're currently doing, and that IRP process, the Integrated Resource Plan, is an opportunity for all of us to express that we expect them to do more. But even as individual businesses or homeowners, you do have the freedom to put solar on your home or business. There are a couple different programs that TVA offers. They used to be much more attractive than they currently are. GPP is the one that comes to mind. It's the Green Power Partners program, or Green Power Providers. I can't remember what the second P stands for. And so if you were to put solar panels on your home, you would sell the power generated from your rooftop to TVA while you're still continuing to buy power back from your local power company. And up until this year, what they were paying you for what you generate and sell to TVA was at the same retail rate that you were paying the local power company for what you buy from them. And incidentally, that's what customers in Tennessee have told us they want. We did some polling last year, and that was one of the questions. And a significant majority of people in Tennessee said, well, the rate should be the same. When they buy power from you and when you buy power from them, it should net out. Well, TVA is changing now with the new GPP program for this year, for 2018, to where if you have 10 kilowatts or less on your roof, they pay you 9 cents per kilowatt hour fixed for the next 20 years. If you have 10 kilowatts or more of solar on your roof, that rate drops to 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, fixed for 20 years. And yet the retail rates that you're paying the LPC who's providing you your power, inevitably those will go up. So it's no longer connected to the retail rates at all. And that's rather unfortunate. It makes the economic modeling on this very risky, and it makes it rather unattractive to do rooftop solar in Tennessee right now, the way I see this program.
Thanks, Brian. Great answer. As you were answering that question, we had another good one roll in from Jim, and believe it or not, it's not necessarily focused on TVA. Do you have any suggestions on how to support growth in the DG market throughout the Southeast, particularly in Florida?
That is a good question. Well, you may, so just since he said DG, I want to make sure everybody understands the acronym. We're talking about distributed generation. So the small rooftop and small commercial solar, not the utility scale stuff. And you might have noticed that Florida was one of the states where we do see more DG solar growth than we do in the other states. So that's good. There are a few reasons for that. In part, Florida gets more sun than other states. I mean, it is the Sunshine State after all. So there's practical reasons why we would expect solar growth there. You do have, there's a net metering law on the books in Florida that allows net metering, even of a pretty significant size. There's tiers that apply, but for commercial interests, for example, they can go all the way up to 2 megawatts and receive retail net metering. So it's a little different than that TVA program I was explaining, where that's a buy all, sell all dual meter system. But in Florida, you have real net metering, and you get a 1-to-1 offset for what for the period of time when you're over generating, when you have net excess generation. I would say in terms of things that could be done to drive more DG growth in Florida, I think, and our colleagues from SACE are part of one of these the kind of solar co-ops with FL Sun, Solar United Neighborhoods. I think that kind of thing is a model that really can drive growth, because then you're not necessarily negotiating just for the best pricing you can get on your own rooftop. You're banding together and to a certain extent are getting some economies of scale by aggregating not so much the purchase, but at least the bids that you're getting when you're dealing with the solar developers. So I think that's probably one of the short-term things that can drive growth in the DG market.
Great, thanks, Brian. And it looks like that is the end of Q&A, but you can see Brian's email right there on the slide, brian@cleanenergy.org, if you have any follow-up questions. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. Today's presentation has been recorded, and we will send you a link to that recording once it's been processed. If you enjoyed today's presentation, consider joining SACE so that we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Again, visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Take care, everyone, and have a great week. Bye.